War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 48, the Mongol Army. Much as the Roman Empire should be, and is, in fact, a subject for an entire dedicated podcast series, so too is the Mongol Empire. Lasting in various forms for over 400 years, it indelibly shaped Central and Western Asia, China, much of the Muslim world, and Eastern and Central Europe. In raw territory, it was twice the size of the Roman Empire or Arab conquests. It was politically intricate, socially flexible, fiscally advanced, and, to the point of this podcast, militarily effective. It was brutal in its military conquests, but no more so than Rome or Athens, the Persians or Mohammedans, and it was not, strictly speaking, particularly unique in any aspect of culture or military capability. It was a combination of factors, not least of which was the flexibility by which it adopted not just military advantages from conquered enemies, but social ones as well. The Mongol army, despite the success it shared with other great empires, differed in one fundamental and critical difference. Whereas the Western way of war, as defined far better by Victor David Hanson and many others, was focused upon territory, the Mongols, much like the Muslims, land was almost entirely irrelevant to the emerging Mongol conquerors. Coming from the seemingly endless steppes of Mongolia and what is now eastern Russia, the seizing of lands meant very little in and of itself to the Mongols. What mattered was gold, treasure, slaves, women, and conquest for its own sake. The Western stubbornness by which holding cultivated land in the defensive was as much a psychological as physical necessity. To hold land was an irrational weakness to the mounted archers that formed the core of the Mongol army. To retreat from a tactically disadvantageous position carried no stigma. If you could live to fight another day, so be it. The hardy small ponies and accompanying flocks of goats and sheep would simply move to other lands suitable for grazing. Unlike the larger horses of the Europeans that required significant forage and grain, the Mongol ponies only needed the ample grass found in vast swaths from the Caucasus to Korea. It was in these areas where the Mongols were strongest, and the more they departed from these, the more difficulties they found. Whereas the Romans solved the challenge of maintaining a massive army through detailed logistical planning, the initial Mongol conquest brought an army that was capable of sustaining itself on seemingly barren lands. This isn't to say the Mongols did not nor could not plan. In fact, they were magnificent planners, conducting detailed analysis of their enemies and the thousands of miles which separated them, ensuring their forward progress would be sustained by the almost entirely deserted lands in between. The start of the Mongol Empire is, unlike so many others, clearly defined, with the consolidation of the various nomadic tribes under the leadership of Temujin, who later was known as Genghis Khan, as were others after him. You can choose your pronunciation here, and it means roughly universal leader. This destruction of the various tribal feuds, which kept the relatively tiny Mongols divided to irrelevance, was accomplished in 1206. Genghis instituted several reforms, which turned the raw warlike potential of the Mongol people into a machine nearly unstoppable in conquest. Additionally, an unseasonably warm period brought rains which increased the herd of horses and flocks of goats and sheep, giving logistical strength to the swelling, newly united Mongols. His armies were organized into a decimal-based configuration. From 10 cavalrymen in the Arban, 10 Arbans to the Zun, 10 Zuns in the Minghans, and finally 10 Minghans in the 10,000-strong Tumans. Above this, as the conquest proceeded, there were 3 divisions, the Bar Ungar in the west, the Imperial Urdu in the middle, and the Jungar in the east. The Imperial bodyguard, known as the Keshek, was far more than the description would suggest. In fact, it served as general staff, war college for promising leaders, a consolidating point for the sons of servant rulers, hostages for lack of a better term. It was this elite force that provided the unity the Khan required to wield his armies and their various units. All of these aforementioned units, to include the basic 10-man Arban, was capable of completely independent action for significant periods of time as part of a greater operation. This capability of independent action wasn't a revolutionary change. Rather, it incorporated an inherent strength of the nomadic society. Every Mongol male was a highly capable soldier starting from the earliest age. They learned riding and archery when not much more than toddlers. Given age-appropriate mounts and bows, they were expected to ride and hunt from the moment they could understand the words of their fathers. Marmots and other small rodents were expected to be hunted and killed by the youngest boys. The indescribably harsh conditions of Mongolia shaped a character seemingly impervious to hardship. There was no difference in their lives whether they were at home, such as it was, or on the march thousands of miles away. Each and every able-bodied man was an elite cavalryman, from which the few million at most Mongols could raise an army comprising nearly 25% of its total population. In fact, the initial armies were sent out at nearly 100,000 men, every one of them a frontline fighter capable of accurate shots from a galloping horse at no closer than 30 meters and by some estimates nearly 200 meters away. They could ride and fire both facing the front of the horse as well as mounted backwards, firing at the enemy as they galloped away. This individual capability was matched to a highly experienced, coordinated effort used in hunting, called the nerge, a circle hunt. Thousands of Mongols would set out and, in small groups, establish a giant circle around an area containing wild game, sometimes hundreds of square miles. This circle would slowly compress, driving the game to the center where the elites would finish the hunt, with few animals escaping. This hunting technique required great planning and coordination to ensure the start and finish was perfectly coordinated across vast areas. This technique was a preferred tactic as the same concept was used when at war. The Mongols would surround a vast area and slowly compress their enemy, man, woman, and child, to a center area, usually a city. They would use horrific methods. Anyone caught in the circle was generally murdered, causing the survivors to flee and strewing panic in their wake of panicked retreat. During the period of actual battle, looting was strictly prohibited. Chinggis, rightly fearing that the loss of pressure and discipline could lead to defeat. Rather, it was only after the battle and on the Great Khan's orders that the loot was consolidated and fairly distributed to all his warriors. There was no fear of missing out, as is so often the case when a seeming victory is lost in the passionate desire to gather as much concrete gains of victory as possible for each individual soldier. Likewise, the families of fallen Mongol warriors were taken care of by the Great Khan. Men need not fear for their children should they fall in his service. Those militaries that stood and fought in open terrain were harassed and attrited by seemingly endless waves of archers who would gallop up, letting fly as many arrows as possible, and then riding away before becoming entangled with the pikemen of their enemy. Usually, this was enough to cause the enemies to break and run, from which arrows in the back could only be expected. Should the enemy hold their lines, the Mongols would simply ride off into the endless grasslands to attack at a later, more opportune time. Should the enemy consolidate at a hardened fort, the Mongols had a few tactics at hand. First was to simply surround the enemy, for years if necessary, to starve them out. The previous pressure tactics had usually caused these cities to have a swollen population already, far exceeding the food, water, or sanitary conditions necessary for long-term survival. Should the city prove extraordinarily hardy, the Mongols would often feign retreat, hoping the survivors would chase them only to be caught in an ambush. At times, diverting water into or away from the city would be used. If possible, poisoning the water supply would also be used. Later, primitive siege engines would be incorporated into the Mongol armies from captured or volunteer Chinese. Other conquered people would provide heavy cavalry with armor and pike, specialist engineers, and some not much more than cannon fodder. Having conquered a people, the conquered had no rights or value beyond that which they provided their Mongol masters. Those artisans with skills might be sent to newly established Mongol cities or serve their new masters. Those with no skills would either be executed outright or saved to be used for suicide missions in future battles. Examples of their use included literally walking in front of the mounted Mongols to act as arrow sponges, or to push siege engines such as ladders into place against the walls of a besieged city. Later still, European-designed trebuchets would be built for use in sieges against far stronger Chinese castles and city walls. But the most effective strategy the Mongols had against sieges was their policy against those who stood against them. Against the city that surrendered immediately, surprising leniency could be expected more often than not. But against any city that refused to accept the Mongol mandate of heaven, the results were no different than Malaya or Carthage, utter and complete destruction of the city itself. The instant execution of anyone found inside, with the possible exception of those women whose use would provide temporary pleasure and execution usually followed. Nevertheless, it did not take long for such actions to derive the required effect. Most fortresses, especially those primitive ones found in Central and Eastern Europe, surrendered nearly instantly. The Mongols were not impatient in implementing this policy. One mountain fortress located near the southern Caucasus stood firm for 15 years against a surrounding Mongol force before finally submitting and being completely destroyed. Following the destruction of their enemy and the extraction of promised tribute, an occupying force, usually made up of conquered enemies, led by Mongols, called the Tama, was established. These were effectively border guards as well as occupiers. These initial Mongol armies that took Europe by storm moved amazing distances, 10 to 15 miles per day for nearly half a year, with zero logistical demands save the grass they rode upon. As the Mongols penetrated deeper into Europe and the fortresses became more robust, a far slower army comprising the foreign specialists incorporated into their army put brakes on this fast-moving force. This also necessitated more logistical demands, supplied by the lands they marched through, as Mongolia itself was incapable of providing them. The political intrigues that tore apart the Mongol Empire following the death of the original Chinggis are as fascinating as they are confusing and far beyond my capabilities to accurately relay, but suffice to know that there were four major remaining khanates: the Golden Horde to the northwest, the Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan, who established his capital in what is now Beijing, the Ilkhanate in the southwest areas extending through Syria, Turkey, and Iran, and the Chagatai, which comprised the heart of Mongolia and the center of the competing khanates. Of the middle two, the Yuan and the Ilkhanate, both territories' rulers adopted native customs and religions as an attempt to legitimize their rule. Kublai Khan established himself as a quasi-Chinese ruler, and Ghazan in 1295 converted to Islam when taking the throne of the Ilkhanate. Likewise, the northern Golden Horde Khanate a few decades later adopted Islam as well. The Golden Horde and Ilkhanate often fought each other as they had utterly subdued their territories. Ultimately, the demise of the Mongol Empire was the loss of the lifestyle which created them. The indescribably harsh life which molded both men and leaders were replaced by city life, opulent by any standard, and certainly so to the nomad from outer Mongolia. Unless every man was capable of fighting, there simply was not enough Mongols to man an empire, even one incorporating hundreds of thousands of conquered people as auxiliary forces. And as more and more Mongols enjoyed the fruits of tribute and conquest by settling in newly established cities, built by Chinese engineers, fewer and fewer saw need or want to expand or maintain the empire, so it too fell apart. I have been fortunate in my military career to have been to Mongolia several times. Its now capital city, Ulaanbaatar, or Ubi City, is as depressing a city as you can imagine. It is notably the coldest capital in the world. If Brutalist was a city, Ubi is its personification. Half of the population of Mongolia lives within its hazy borders. It has a giant coal-powered power plant that supplies not just electricity, but hot water as well to its 1.5 million inhabitants. I cannot recommend it. But escape the confines of Ulaanbaatar to the grass steppes and various mountains and scant forests, the beauty and mystique of Mongolia becomes clear. Likewise, the vestiges of those attributes which conquered the world. The Mongolians have three national sports: horseback riding, archery, and wrestling. The ponies remain small, and children as young as 6 partake in races several miles long, often bareback. Archery is practiced by both men and women, and their wrestling, known as bok, has led to a rise of Mongolian success in both sumo as well as international wrestling. Of note, the uniform of the bok wrestler must be seen to be understood. Cowboy boots and a bikini are the best I can offer. It's worth an internet search. Chinggis Khan himself demanded that his chief generals wrestle. In fact, the largest wrestling competition in the world was held in Mongolia, with several thousand wrestlers taking part in just one competition. The cultural impact the Mongols had upon the world pales in comparison to Rome, Greece, Arabia, Britain, and, of course, America. Their language remains isolated, save Khan being ubiquitous as a title throughout their former lands. But their impact is far more visceral and, frankly, biological. Having traveled many of the lands formerly conquered by the Mongols, those of Mongolian descent can be seen throughout. What is known collectively as the stands are, to a great deal, ethnically, at least partially, Mongol. But one area that managed to avoid the Mongolian conquest was Yemen. It was isolated by vast expanses of the Arabian desert that even the hardy Mongol ponies could not cross, and is now dominating the news. Why is Yemen, the right hand of Arabia, in the news, And what significance does it have for Western interests? Something we will go over next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit. And check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.